I'm Melanie Bazin, Director of Indigenous Services at Crisis and Trauma Resource Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today and creating time in your day to learn more about critical incident group debriefing. And we would love to hear your voice as we're here today together. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat function. We'll have a few questions posed by our speaker as well, so make sure you get your answers in the chat. There will be some time at the end for Q&A as well. I'd now like to introduce our speaker for today, Jody Walker. She's the Clinical Director at Crisis and Trauma Resource Institute. And in addition to the awesome work she does for CTRI, Jody also is a registered psychotherapist who treats first responders living with PTSD, depression, or anxiety. I know she's thrilled to be here today to help us understand more about the value of critical incident group debriefings. So Jody, over to you.
Thanks, Melanie. I'm super excited that we're doing this together. It's always fun when we collaborate. And I'm super excited to talk about critical incident group debriefing. It's one of my favorite interventions to do for groups of people who have been impacted by trauma. So you see, I have been working in the helping for profession for about 30 years and have helped people who've been impacted by trauma in various ways. So whether that be interpersonal violence, such as domestic violence, sexual assaults, families of homicide, but I've also had the opportunity to help people impacted by trauma who essentially kind of shown up to do their job, and by virtue of a really hard day and a critical incident in the workplace, have been severely and significantly impacted by a critical incident. So that includes our first responders, but also people who work in, say, settings where there's heavy machinery or things that can kind of go sideways pretty fast. And all of a sudden, what feels like kind of a normal repetitive day, all of a sudden feels very different. So myself, I have had the opportunity to be a volunteer on two different critical incident group teams. One was in Ontario, Canada, and the other was in the United States when I lived down there. So responding to first responders in a multidisciplinary team capacity. So this is us doing debriefings for police, fire, paramedics, led or co-facilitated by a mental health clinician and a peer first responder who is trained in the model we were using. As a result of having kind of this shared understanding and learning of a critical incident group debriefing process, I was asked a couple different times to respond during 9/11. So the first time was a few days after the attack. So the attack happened on a Tuesday. By Friday, I was actually down at ground zero, preparing for the upcoming week to do various critical incident group debriefings. And again, 4 months later, where we collaborated with New York City Police Department's peer support team to do, again, group debriefings for the police officers that were first on scene during 9/11. As well as I've had the opportunity to take the model and really do what feels like literally hundreds of debriefings during the pandemic for York Region Ontario's public health team, the nurses during that time, as well as the paramedic services and leadership. So again, I've had experience in the workplace as well as responding to line of duty deaths, different ways that we can take the critical incident group debriefing model and really help communities and people who've been impacted by trauma. So let's kind of dive in today. We have a short amount of time, Melanie. We have to cram in a lot of information within our time together. So let's do it. So we've got some learning objectives. What we're going to explore here today is kind of what is the critical incident group debriefing process. We're going to explore together some various workplace critical incidents, what those might look like for your setting, and common responses for people who've experienced a critical incident. We're going to look at our CTRI model itself, and then we're going to end our time together with you, Melanie, sharing with the community here who's listening on some differences it might include for our Indigenous communities. And of course, we're going to spend a little bit of time just talking about some of the benefits and some of the challenges. So, what is a critical incident? Really, a critical incident is a situation outside of our normal frame of reference, right? That challenges instantly. It's really kind of that shock trauma. That normal, typical day gets significantly interrupted by something that was unexpected. And in the moment of that critical incident occurring, has left us feeling a lack of control, a lack of sense of safety. And it's really that sense of, I now know that in an instant, my world can be totally changed. So when we do a critical incident group debriefing, it's really in response to an event that has occurred and is now over versus an ongoing event or complex trauma, which is described as so example would be intergenerational trauma or repetitive chronic abuse that one has experienced. That is not a critical incident that we would use critical incident group debriefing for. When we think about the impact of a critical incident and how that shock what happens is it gets stored differently in our brain. And as a result, the story doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. And as a result, we're left with a host of symptoms or reactions, which we're going to explore. But before we do so, let's look at some examples of what could be critical incidents. So if we look at kind of categories of kind of shock traumas, the first would be environmental disasters. So communities that have been impacted, say, by hurricanes or tornadoes. I know for myself, a community about 40 minutes from myself last year was impacted by a tornado where it took out much housing and small businesses. So it really impacted the community. We have fires as an example, tsunamis in certain parts of the world, so environmental disasters. Critical incidents can also include accidents. So we look at bringing a critical incident group debriefing response into a workplace. It could include our colleagues and coworkers that we work side by side with every day. And all of a sudden there was an accident in the workplace that now has left someone either significantly injured or impacted or even death. But it could also include a coworker who was in a horrible car accident and now is completely debilitated or has died as a result of that car accident. That's going to greatly impact the colleagues that have been working with the coworker. So sudden death or injury and violence, violence in communities has this ripple effect and impact, as well as violence in the workplace. How about other examples for our participants who are listening here today? Can you give us other examples in your community or your workplace that might be an example of a critical incident that you would want to respond to?
Yeah, so somebody in the chat mentioned death of a child or coworker in a hospital you work at.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So now that we have some examples of what a critical incident may be and how shocking it is, let's look at what is a critical incident group debriefing. So really what a critical incident group debriefing is, it's a short-term group intervention process, really that focuses on the immediate event that has just occurred and impacted a group of people. It offers participants a place to talk and share experiences. You see, when we experience trauma, trauma is very isolating. And actually, what trauma does, it whispers in our ear, don't talk about the bad thing. Don't tell other people you're experiencing reactions. I look around, it seems like everyone else is coping. Why can't I cope? So it becomes very isolating, right? So when we bring people together in this guided process, it allows people to start to process, talk, and share, as well as the facilitators have an opportunity in the process to teach people about common reactions to critical incident stress and really emphasize healthy coping in the impact of that incident. So let's pause before we look more at the model just to talk about bringing a trauma-informed lens to the intervention. See, here at CTRI, we strongly believe and want the world to be trauma-informed. And this includes people who take our training on critical incident group debriefing. We include training and teachings on becoming trauma-informed. Why? Is because that helps you make trauma-informed decisions around the types of interventions that might be necessary when a group is impacted by a critical incident, because they might need more or additional support than a group intervention, or a group intervention may not be appropriate given the circumstances. For example, if people are displaced because of fire, as an example, they don't have housing, or it was a shelter and people don't have a place to go. People aren't emotionally or physically safe yet. Or there might be highly confidential circumstances, such as police when there's professional standards involved. So being trauma-informed increases this awareness around how and when we bring people together, which means we look at the groupings or the clustering of people impacted. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a sec. And really, this trauma-informed lens, as facilitators, creates a sense of connection for people, and in doing so, normalizes their reactions in a safe way, validates their experience, and also offers that teachings on things and reactions that they can anticipate perhaps in the next few weeks. It's really about helping people who now experience a sense of lack of control in their world. And by bringing people in this guided process, helps start to restore some of that control. You see, what happens when we experience trauma, some of our core beliefs become shattered. So core beliefs are things that we have in order to function in our world, such as before trauma exposure, we could have the core assumption that, that good things happen to good people. And if we're good, good will come my way. I don't know about you, but my aunts taught me, kind of everything happens for a reason. And largely our world is predictable and we can keep ourselves safe. The difficulty when we experience a critical incident, it shatters these core assumptions, because now we absolutely have experienced that actually really terrible things can happen to really good people, and there's actually no meaning behind it. And now we also have this shattered assumption about our safety. The world now feels unpredictable to us, that in an instant, something terrible can happen to me or someone who I love deeply. And as a result, when these core assumptions and the impact of a critical incident occur, we have reactions. And so these reactions we can look at in kind of clusters of symptoms. So emotional symptoms, cognitive or thinking, physical reactions, behaviors, and spiritual. So what this means is in our emotions, we can have great vacillation between really big emotions, right? Sadness to shock and numb, guilt, fear. Our cognitions or our thinking can be impacted. It can be really difficult to concentrate and retain information and follow conversations. Our memory might be impacted. If there's guilt involved, if we have the emotion of guilt, our thinking might be like, I caused the bad thing to happen, which it might be actually distortion. Physical, we can have physical reactions. Like, for example, my body might respond to stress by having an upset stomach or digestion issues or tightness in my chest. And behaviors, as I try to cope with the distress, I might turn to things that I once turned to in times of stress that might not be so healthy for me. For example, substance use. I might have difficulty sleeping, either difficulty getting to sleep or falling asleep. And spiritually, because now my core assumption that things happen for a reason and I am protected in this world, spiritually, I might be quite angry at my creator that I now feel so unsafe. Or if we don't have formal faith, spiritually, we might feel so disconnected from our community. Really, bringing people together in a critical incident group debriefing is emphasizing that, oh my goodness, you are all normal people having normal reactions to a really abnormal event. If we look at kind of the cluster of symptoms that can occur in terms of reactions, we cluster it from kind of arousal or highly activated symptoms. So our emotions are intense, we might be talking fast, our breath might be shallow, our heart rate might be increased. We might have a greater hypervigilance for our safety, or alternatively, our bodies might put us into kind of a shutdown mode where we are numb and withdrawing because we're still in shock. We feel kind of dissociated or out of our body or zoning out. So when we look at key components of a critical incident group debriefing and how it can be helpful for those impacted, it includes defining what is a critical incident. So starting in your workplace to start to gather some examples of what might be in need of a response. It includes that trauma-informed lens, which we talked about. And it also includes the importance of preparing as well as knowing your group's realities. These pieces are just as important as actually following the model. Preparing is gathering information about the variables of the event. Who is involved? Are there interpersonal dynamics involved in terms of bringing people together? Are people emotionally in that place that they can come together as a group? It's also having that awareness of the group's realities, right? Have they slept yet? I'll give you a great example. I was asked to be a part of facilitating a critical incident group debriefing when there was a line of duty death for a police officer. So the officer was shot. There was 2 perpetrators on the loose, and then the colleagues spent the evening kind of having to go through like a bush area all night in order to capture the assailants. So they did so. They caught and arrested them. And then we were asked to do a debriefing in the early morning for those who were out all night. Well, the officers were cold, tired, wet, hungry, and in shock. They had just lost a colleague. They wanted to go home. They wanted to eat and sleep. And most importantly, they wanted to just hug their family. The last place they wanted to be was sitting in a circle talking about their emotions and reactions. So it's having that awareness from that trauma-informed lens about what your group needs and when. When we consider clustering our groups together, it's also that consideration of trying to prevent further impact of the critical incident. What that means is we don't want to group people together who've not experienced what those who witnessed or were directly involved experienced. We don't want to add images to people's head who weren't there. So when we are starting to look at bringing people together, it's clustering them in groups where they've had like experiences. So in this example here, we've got those who are directly involved. So if I use the example of a workplace violence and someone comes in with a gun to the workplace, we've got those who directly saw the gun person come in, hold up the weapon, heard the threats, had to take shelter. Those are the directly involved. Those who witnessed, maybe they were kind of behind a glass partition. And then the others might be those coworkers who weren't at work that day, but they're impacted because now all of a sudden that sense of my workplace is no longer safe. It's not this predictable safe place that it was yesterday before the critical incident occurred. So let's look at kind of appropriate settings. Why I love the critical incident group debriefing model is because it is so flexible to bring into different settings. So when we look at communities, we've got Indigenous communities, we've got different communities who might be impacted by a critical incident, such as perhaps we've got a small community where a young person dies unexpectedly and in a tragic way, or a prominent leader in our community. Organizations, this can include nonprofits to corporate, right? We've got different settings, but yet we've got people who can be just as impacted by a critical incident that occurs in their workplace. When you think about an organization, it can also include, for example, a sports team, a hockey team where a young person on the hockey team unexpectedly and tragically dies. We want to bring together the teammates to do a formal critical incident debriefing. We might want to do a separate debriefing for the parents, separate debriefing for the coaches. Schools, we've got lockdowns, we have death of students, death of teachers, different examples of why critical incident group debriefing would be so helpful for different populations within the school setting as well. And of course, our emergency service people, these critical incident group debriefings are really helpful for those calls that have kind of that high impact for them. Line of duty death, or significant injury of a coworker, or calls involving children. So as examples of different settings for critical incident. So let's just pause, Melanie, and ask the group here, what types of critical incidents might you be responding to? So think about your community or your workplace. What are examples of events that might be occurring for you that you would think maybe a critical incident group debriefing would be helpful?
So we've had a few people asking some questions as well as sharing things that they might be responding to. So mass layoff, and the question was, does a mass layoff constitute a critical incident from a psychological safety standpoint?
That's a great question, right? And I think it comes back to knowing your group, right? So if suddenly and unexpectedly we have mass layoffs that are going to really be impacting families and a community, absolutely we could use the model to do a debriefing.
And MJ O'Connor says, when is it not appropriate to do a debriefing? Thought this was an interesting question.
It is an interesting question, right? So again, coming back to looking at kind of the group, right? So when it might not be, is if people are still in such a heightened emotional state that they're not psychologically ready to share in a group setting. Another example might be if it isn't safe in the workplace. So if in that preparation phase, if you're working with management and you're starting to gather some background about the incident and the people that work there, perhaps there's lots of dynamics where people don't trust each other. And therefore, so if they don't trust each other, they're really not going to come together and be kind of vulnerable in a group setting. Again, psychological and physical safety are factors that have to be in place before we bring people together. Great questions.
Yeah, and a few people also mentioned suicide, suicidal ideation, and then also violence in the workplace. And then Shaylin was curious about a critical incident death due to overdose, and somebody mentioning suicide as well. These could be isolated events, but also something that's part of an ongoing crisis. So does CIGD still apply?
Yeah, it comes back to knowing the group and the community, right? So those are absolutely examples of a critical incident where someone suddenly, unexpectedly and traumatically dies. People are going to be impacted. So again, looking at kind of context, we could do a critical incident group debriefing, or if we have things that the community still needs to respond to kind of keep the community as a whole psychologically safe, those factors might need to be put in place first before we consider doing the debriefing. We're going to look at timing. Actually, this is segues into when is a good time to do a debriefing, because you can see here, preparation includes answering all these questions first, but then it could include doing a critical incident group debriefing within a day or two of the incident, but up to just even a couple weeks later, if certain things need to be stabilized before we pull people together. Again, we look at key elements include natural groups, right? Clustering appropriately based on exposure. And at CTRI, we really strongly believe in that co-facilitation model. So co-facilitation is two facilitators. So what, and it could look different, like you could take turns sharing the different steps of the debriefing process, or one person might lead the entire debriefing, and the second person is kind of the eyes and ears keeping watch on everyone in the group. And if someone has to leave the group because they're in a heightened emotional state, that second facilitator can step out into the hallway or take them to kind of a quieter space to help regulate and perhaps even bring them back to the group. We really encourage from that trauma-informed lens that the critical incident debriefing process is voluntary. Voluntary to come, and as well as if you're there, voluntary to participate. Trauma robs us of choice. And so being given the option to attend is really a trauma-informed step. And although we're in our teachings of our model, it is a step-by-step, but at the same time, we're working with people. So we have to have some flexibility and fluidity in implementing the model. So what are some benefits? Well, it can reduce some rumor mill. It can offer an opportunity to bring people together to actually share kind of what's next. Particularly if there was a death in the workplace, as an example, it gives an opportunity to share when memorials might be held, community events. So it offers both reducing rumors as well as disseminating information. Really, though, it's really an acknowledgement, right? That you have gone through something sad, something scary that has dramatically changed your world. And by the employer offering an opportunity during the workday to come and do a critical incident group debriefing experience, it sends a strong message as an organization or a business. I care about you. I care that this happened to you, and I care that you were impacted. It works towards increasing stability, meaning at a certain point when the facilitators are teaching about healthy coping for traumatic stress, right? We're guiding people towards healthy options and resources. It provides an opportunity for the facilitators to kind of do like a bird's eye view or assessment of how people are coping and offering opportunities for additional resources past the critical incident group debriefing. The facilitators also can see kind of who might need a one-on-one outreach after the group experience. Some challenges for those of you who have been doing some research as you're exploring models that you might want to implement, or do you want to do a critical incident group debriefing? There is some research that came up after 9/11, really, that challenged some of the benefits and efficacy of critical incident group debriefing. When you really dig into the research, it really highlights, though, the problems came when it wasn't trauma-informed, when the proper preparation wasn't done, when the proper grouping of people wasn't done, and really kind of the being forced. It wasn't voluntary. So those are some of the aspects that can create further harm. So let's take a few minutes here to just look at the the process itself. So in our critical incident group debriefing process with CTRI, we offer a 4-step or 4 phases to the intervention. We bring people together who clustered appropriately based on their exposure to the incident. Step 1 is about introducing facilitators, introducing the process. For example, I would say we're here today because we all were a part of a critical incident where someone came into the workplace with a gun. This is a voluntary experience. Being here is voluntary, as well as participating is voluntary. So I'm going to go around the group one by one, asking a question. You have the opportunity to pass at any time. So in the introduction phase, I'm setting some ground rules, which should also include ensuring confidentiality, getting people's assurances that everything that is shared in the room stays in the room. It also includes in that preparation phase, but double checking, is there rank in the room? Is there management in the room? To make sure that people are comfortable sharing and that we have appropriately created our groups. After we've laid the introduction phase, the next is exploring. Here we're exploring the impact of the critical incident. We do this in a guided way, one question at a time, starting with a question related to cognitions or thinking. That's followed up by another question on how our emotions or our feelings. And then the third question when we go around the group is related to how we're coping now. So as example, where were you when this happened? What were some of your initial thoughts? As we then get into emotion questions, what's the hardest? What's the hardest for you now? What still stands out for you? What some of emotions and feelings have you been experiencing? And then coping questions. How have you coped before when you're sad or angry or scared? So once we have asked each of those questions in the exploration phase, we then spend time teaching. This is where the facilitators take over. We prepared ahead of time and determine who's teaching what. And it's just doing some psychoeducation on common critical incident stress reactions. Offers an opportunity to highlight kind of shared experiences amongst the group, normalizing and validating, hey, I've heard a number of you talk about how hard it is to sleep since this happened. That's so normal. Here are some tips and strategies to help normalize your sleep again. After the teaching phase, we have the closing. The closing really is a summary of and thanking people for their participation. It might include information if there was a death that we're debriefing and talking about upcoming services or memorials. It also includes handing out resources for further and ongoing support. After this, we loiter with intention. That means after we've thanked the participants and they're on their way out, the facilitators make time to intentionally stay behind to ensure that if there's someone who just wasn't comfortable asking a question in the group, that it gives an opportunity for one-on-one to further connect them to resources to help them. So Melanie, what do you think about some differences around the critical incident group debriefing process when you're offering this to Indigenous communities?
Thanks, Jody. I think every community can be so different, so it's very important for people to ask questions. If you're not sure, ask about who might be a respected elder in the community, who can maybe be there to offer additional support. What might the protocols be? Should we be offering tobacco? Should we be incorporating ceremony? Should we smudge before we meet? And also considering where to meet in the community. Are people more comfortable outdoors? Is there a central gathering place that people can meet at? So basically, it's a lot about finding out what the community might want by asking questions and building relationships.
That's beautiful. Really kind of the connection between what I was sharing earlier and what you're sharing now with your wisdom around supporting Indigenous communities is the importance of that preparation phase, right? Going into communities impacted and really spending time first to understand what the potential impact is, what are the dynamics, who are the key people who are a support to that community. So this is where we turn it over to those listening to see what questions might be out there.
So there were a lot of questions coming in as you were talking, Jody, which is very exciting. So one person was wondering, some incidents might be critical to some, but not others. And how would you manage that disparity between those two?
Oh, that's a great question. So remember I said how attending the debriefing is voluntary, right? So we're going to now make the assumption based on the question that 10 people have come to the debriefing and 3 or 4 of them are like, I'm here. I don't really feel impacted, but I'm going to come to check out what this is all about. In my in my introduction, I actually introduce that concept. And I say, not everyone is going to have the same reactions. Not everyone is going to be impacted in the same way. And in fact, those who feel right now aren't having reaction, what a strong message of support that you are here to support those in the group that are impacted. So thank you everyone for being here.
Great. Another question, which I thought was interesting, is there a rule of thumb for the size of the group? So as an example, in a bomb threat that might affect 100 people.
Mhm. Yeah. This is a very common question. Remember the phases and stages of the model, right? We have 4 steps to get through, and the exploration phase actually has at least 3 questions within it. So we want to ensure that we have enough time to get everyone in the group through all the steps, all the different questions, and then end with teaching and end with closure. Because if we have a group that's too big and I only get through up until teaching and I don't have a chance to teach and hand out resources, we're leaving people are leaving the group very open and vulnerable and not grounded. So with that, personally, I like 10 is kind of my magic number. And if we had 100 people impacted, we're going to have to probably bring in some extra resource to facilitate a number of group debriefings.
Perfect. Another question, do organizations need to have the facilitators be mental health clinicians or therapists?
Another great question. So I've done debriefings in different ways. One has been, it depends on your organization's kind of policies and procedures around what their comfort is. So for example, first responder organizations, a lot of them have a co-facilitation. One facilitator is a mental health clinician, and the second is a first responder trained in the model. But we have communities where we have people working in those communities that are trauma informed in terms of their awareness, the work that they've done. They have the capacity to facilitate a group process, so they have those skills. So really, it's about people's skills and experience and comfort level of facilitating.
Great. I think this next question can lead us into our closing here.
Okay.
I'm conscious of our time, but what's the best Coles Note training available to those who don't have much time or resources to do much more than a couple of hours of training? So I'm wondering if you can give us a bit of information about what CTRI can offer.
Oh, you are so good, Melanie, with your transition. So yes, at CTRI, we highly respect people's various needs of learning, whether that be financial resources, whether that be time, or the way you learn. So we have, if you visit our website, you will see you can attend in-person workshops to learn. You can have facilitators come into your organizations, or you can take on-demand or webinars, right? We have different ways to introduce content and information to people. You can sign up to receive our newsletter. And those who sign up to our newsletter today are actually going to get a free trauma-informed care manual. So that's pretty exciting. And I also wanted to highlight on December 9th in Toronto, I am teaching critical incident group debriefing. We call this a public workshop, so anyone can sign up and attend. It's not for a specific organization. So again, you can find that information on our website. Well, I knew our time would go so fast, Melanie. So I'm super excited to have done this with you, Melanie, and as well for all of you who've tuned in your day to hear more about critical incident group debriefing. And I really hope some of the information was helpful, and I really hope I've sparked an interest for you to want to explore how you can bring this valuable intervention to your community or your workplace. So thank you, everyone, for attending today.
Yes, thank you for joining us.